Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today we're going to be talking about really important comic book creators that just for one reason or another dealt with some extreme financial hardships or other reasons why they needed community help. A little sad, I admit, but I'll explain why I'm talking about it in a moment. I wanted to explain this is going to be mostly a story time episode. Not a lot of images, not a lot of editing. That's because I'm currently working on a much bigger, more complex episode for everybody, and so I just needed a little more time, and I wanted to still put out something on a weekly basis. So this is mostly me talking to you, a little different, but I think that the stories themselves are pretty interesting. So the reason this came up is the Supergirl movie came out this weekend. Got me thinking about the creators behind Superman and Supergirl. I thought it would be a good time to call out a part of the problematic history of comic books. The fact that there are a lot of artists and writers who've contributed, incredibly iconic stories and characters, lasting contributions to comics, but then they've dealt with financial and health challenges. There isn't necessarily a good support system for these creators. So, admittedly, this episode, a little bit sad in some ways, but I think still interesting and relevant, because I'm going to tell you 10 kind of sad stories that we can hopefully learn from. Maybe we can learn to give recognition and help to creators in the modern day. Maybe we can come up with something better to help them out, as compared to what we'll learn from these. So, here we go. Let's do it. So I want to talk first about Bill Finger, and I have made an entire episode about his life and contributions, if you want to know more. But Bill Finger was instrumental in shaping Batman into the version we recognize today, the enduring cultural icon that he remains today. He co-created not only Batman's visual identity, the dark costume, the cowl, the cape. He also created core elements that endure. Gotham City, the Joker, Robin. These were all things that he worked on. But despite his foundational role in one of the most important superheroes out there, Finger worked primarily as an uncredited ghostwriter for Bob Kane. He did this for decades. And so he never received official recognition for everything he created during his lifetime. He had a lot of issues with financial instability plaguing him. He didn't have ownership rights. He didn't have consistent royalties from the massively successful character that he helped define. And by the end of his life, he was largely forgotten by the industry. He died in relative obscurity and poverty in 1974. Only decades later did advocacy by historians and fans and what remained of his family lead to DC Comics finally crediting him officially as Batman's co-creator. Next, Joe Shuster. Now, Joe Shuster is the artist behind Superman. Very important, right? He co-created the character alongside his friend Jerry Siegel, the writer. That helped launch the entire superhero genre with Action Comics #1 in 1938. Shuster's artwork, it was, for the time, clean, it was dynamic, and I think it defined a lot of the visual language that early superhero stories used. A lot of them were trying to duplicate the success of what Superman was, because Superman was a huge hit right away. However, Shuster and Siegel famously sold the rights for Superman to what became DC Comics, then National Publications, for a pretty modest sum. I mean, it wasn't bad, but it was a pretty modest sum. And they lost control over what obviously became one of the most lucrative intellectual properties. I don't even like to call it that, but if we're talking business sense, that's what it is. Intellectual properties in history. DC sort of allowed them to do some work for hire on the character that they created, but they owned it. DC owned it. And then they eventually sort of got replaced by newer guys and cheaper guys. Shuster struggled to find steady work after that. He started to deal with all sorts of financial hardships and deteriorating eyesight that actually left him legally blind. So that took away a lot of what he could do. You know, an artist needs to be able to see well to draw. They need their eyes and they need their hands. Or at least some way to draw. Anyway, in the 1970s, one sort of bright spot to this, it's not perfect, but there was a public campaign by fans as well as pros like Neil Adams that led to DC granting Shuster and Siegel a modest lifetime pension and health care benefits. But Shuster died in 1992, having received some recognition later in life, like really towards the end of his life, but never the full financial rewards of his creation. And so to go with that, number 3 is definitely going to be Jerry Siegel, Superman's co-creator, the original writer. He infused the character with a moral clarity. He created an aspirational heroism, you know, somebody that you'd want to be. It became a template for the entire genre, or subgenre you might call it, of superhero comics. Like Shuster, Siegel lost the rights to Superman early, spent decades in legal battles, financial uncertainty. At times he had to work odd jobs like being a mail clerk, you know, like, so he obviously was not a wealthy man. And he watched as DC and other people got kind of rich off of his creation. 1975 began a public outcry because they were filming a live-action movie. That was a big deal. And that did, of course, lead to DC giving them the pensions, a little bit of credit, you know, but not like in print. They said like, oh yeah, these guys created them. But it didn't say that in print until like after they were gone. So Siegel died in 96. He lived long enough to see a little bit more acknowledgement for what he created, but not really full restitution. Here's another creator that I've made an entire episode about because his story is just huge and wild, and that's Fletcher Hanks. He was an outsider artist of the Golden Age. He created some bizarre, surreal, pretty brutal superhero stories. Stardust, the Super Wizard, kind of better known now. Phantoma, which was one of the very first female superhero characters. His work was published in the late 1930s, and it stood apart from everything else because it had these weird, rigid compositions. It had, you know, heroes, I'll put in quotes, that were like morally absolute. They were kind of sadistic, honestly. The punishment on the villains was way more extreme than what you'd see in other superhero comics. And then Hanks abruptly disappeared from comics. He probably could have been a lot more popular and well-known because his comics were weird and they stood out. But his life after that was marked by alcoholism, instability. He got estranged from his family. His son later described him as abusive. He died alone and destitute in 1976. He reportedly froze to death on a park bench at night. So he was like basically living homeless, and he froze. Super dark. Hanks received no industry recognition or support during his lifetime. It's only posthumously that people have rediscovered his work, and he's gained a cult appreciation. Pretty tough. Next is the reason I'm doing this episode, and I was thinking about Otto Binder. He was a writer that just created so much fun stuff. He was really prolific in comics. He wrote tons of stories for Captain Marvel, Shazam, Captain Marvel, you know, expanded the Marvel family. A lot of his stories on Captain Marvel and later Superman was all about expanding the family. It's kind of beautiful in a way. You know, there's Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel. Then there was Supergirl. He was expanding all those ideas. He helped introduce really important stuff. Supergirl. He was the writer that brought in Supergirl. Brainiac, super important villain. Legion of Superheroes, probably going to get bigger in the next year or two. But, you know, like just tons and tons of concepts. Just tons of ideas for both Captain Marvel and Superman. And Binder then took all the money that he'd made in comics and he invested it into a magazine called Space World around 1960. And that only lasted a year and a half, and it went bankrupt. He'd had to mortgage his house to get enough money to get this magazine up and running, and he just lost it all. And he had to sort of start over again. And then, just a few years later, 1967, his only child, 14-year-old daughter, was hit and killed by a car. At that point, Binder and his wife spent their last several years just working hard to make ends meet, but utterly devastated emotionally. Binder eventually died in 1974. He was only 63 years old. That's not really that old. Long career, respected, but not necessarily financially secure. Didn't really get any public assistance. There were no industry safety nets to help at that point. Here's another tough one, Jack Cole. Now, Jack Cole, he kind of revolutionized comic art a little bit by creating Plastic Man. And that really combined like visual humor with superheroes. He was definitely a great artist, sleek, kinetic, cartooning. I think he still influences plenty of artists today, even though he had a relatively brief career. But yeah, he had fluidity, there was comic timing, and there had been sort of two popular things. There were the comic strips that were funny, there were superheroes, and this sort of bridged some of those early popular subgenres. And so he had a lot of professional success, but he struggled with depression, dissatisfaction with where he was in life. Even after he transitioned from comics into what ostensibly paid a lot more, magazine illustration work. He did a lot for Playboy. 1958. You could argue it's the height of his career. He's only 43 years old, and he took his own life because he was so depressed and he wasn't getting help from anywhere. He passed away. He still owed money to the publisher of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, to pay off those debts. That came out of what remained of his estate. So, kind of a sad story, even though he created something really iconic. Wally Wood, known really to people that he worked with as Wallace Wood. He didn't really like being called Wally Wood, but he signed things as Wally Wood. That was his brand. And again, this is somebody that I've made a full episode on, and I plan to do more, because he is just such a technically gifted artist. He did so many amazing stories for EC Comics. Cool sci-fi and horror stuff, just really beautiful stuff. He worked on Daredevil briefly, but it did invent Daredevil's red costume, which is obviously what we all know. And then he did tons of work for Mad Magazine. Really beautiful work. Despite his brilliance, lots of people loved his art as fans, but also like his colleagues in comics knew that Wally Wood was just a genius. But he was his whole life was marred by chronic health problems. He had kidney failure, vision loss, these debilitating migraines throughout his life. You combine all those health problems with financial instability, because he never really stayed somewhere long enough to make something his own. He never had consistent work, and there was no long-term compensation in comics at the time. There was no royalties or anything. So with declining health, mounting financial obligations, he also took his own life in 1981. Widely respected by his peers, Wally Wood, he didn't benefit from any of the organized industry assistance that would emerge later, places like Heroes Initiative. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Gene Colan. A lot of people love Gene Colan, another artist I've made an episode about. He was very moody art, stylized and more flowing, less rigid, cinematic style. He's really, really good on stuff like Daredevil, Doctor Strange, and, in my opinion, my favorite stuff, Tomb of Dracula. Oh, so good. He used shadow, fluid, moving anatomy, created a unique atmosphere, is I guess what I'm getting at. And despite a long and celebrated career, Colan faced serious financial and health challenges in his later years. He had liver disease. He had failing eyesight. These medical expenses mounted, and he required assistance from the comic community. Fortunately, there were organizations at that point like Hero Initiative. They helped provide financial aid. There were fundraising efforts from fans and professionals to support Gene Colan and his family. But this is a guy that did so much amazing work. You'd think he'd be wealthy enough to handle it all on his own, but he wasn't. Colan passed away in 2011, widely honored. He did get a lot more recognition than some of those Golden Age guys. But I think it's emblematic of how even top-tier creators could struggle without systemic support. Another one I've done a small, or short, I should say, episode about, but a guy I love, Russ Heath. He drew with meticulous realism, particularly his war comics. Sergeant Rock, Enemy Ace, oh my god. He did a war comic, it looked so good. A lot of attention to detail and to authenticity. It set a really high standard. But despite that critical acclaim, Heath spent a lot of his career working under work-for-hire conditions that offered no long-term security. He did some really popular work that was probably seen by even more than just comic readers, because he did designs for the animated G.I. Joe show. That's a lot of people saw that show. In his later years, he talked about it actually. He was living in his own studio space as compared to, an apartment or a house due to financial hardship. The comic community did rally around him. Hero Initiative definitely helped. He had lots of fans that supported him. It's just sort of sad that he needed that, 2018 was when Russ Heath passed away. He's definitely respected as a master craftsman, but a cautionary example, I think, of how the industry historically doesn't have safety nets for health care or, long-term royalty type things. And going into, or continuing in the Bronze Age, I want to talk about Dave Cockrum. Because boy was he popular in his day, and I don't think enough people are remembering him now, 20 years after he's passed. But Dave Cockrum played a crucial role in revitalizing the X-Men in the 1970s. Without Dave Cockrum, they may not have been anywhere near as popular as they became. He co-created iconic characters like Nightcrawler, Storm, Colossus. He helped define that all-new, all-different era that propelled Marvel's mutants to lasting popularity. Despite those contributions, Cockrum did not receive substantial royalties or certainly anything in the way of ownership, and it left him financially vulnerable. So his health declined later in life, especially due to complications from diabetes. Medical bills became overwhelming. Now, the comic community mobilized to support him. There were fundraising drives, assistance coordinated in part through what would become the Hero Initiative. Cockrum passed away in 2006, and I think he did have his legacy secured, but he should have lived longer. He had a lot of health challenges. It was tough for him to keep up with the bills, and it's something that's faced by a lot of people. Those are 10 stories, but I think that when you look at all of them, one recurring element that we come across with these stories is that artists and writers were helped by community efforts, either through public pressure on the publishers, nonprofit assistance by groups like the Hero Initiative. That's a charity I always try to donate to. I basically do every year. Not a lot, but I'm not rich, but that's one that's important to me. And as we get into modern times, crowdfunding is another area that's helped a lot of famous creators. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Peter David, really famous writer on stuff like Hulk and Aquaman, creator-owned books, he needed help with medical and tax bills. But crowdfunding helped a lot. Anyway, I'm hard at work right now on a bigger, fully edited anniversary episode, so please consider hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss that. I will see you very soon. And you know what I'm going to say. Keep reading comics. Take care of each other.